Montana Territory, 1873. The land was still wild enough to swallow a man whole, with winters that froze the marrow in your bones and summers that baked the mercy right out of you. It was no place for the faint-hearted, and certainly no place for love. That was what Wade Vance told himself every morning when he rose before dawn, his breath clouding in the cold cabin air, his 25-year-old frame already bearing the weathered toughness of a man who'd seen too much too young. The Gallatin Valley stretched before him, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. His small ranch sat nestled against the foothills, far enough from Bozeman to avoid most trouble, close enough to sell his modest herd when necessary. Wade had built it all himself after the war, determined to carve something from nothing, to prove he could survive alone when so many of his comrades had not. A man needs nothing but his horse, his gun, and enough sense to use both right, his father had told him before a rebel bullet found him at Shiloh. Wade had lived by those words ever since. Attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed out here. The scars across his back from a Sioux arrow and the knife wound on his thigh from a drunken dispute in a Bozeman saloon were reminders enough. This morning was like any other. Wade saddled his chestnut gelding, checking the cinch with practiced hands. The rising sun gilded the distant mountains, painting them in fire and gold. It would be another scorching August day. His few ranch hands were already moving among the cattle, the distant sounds of their work carrying on the still morning air. "Heading to town, boss?" called Samuel, his oldest hand, a grizzled veteran with one eye and more stories than stars in the Montana sky. "Supply run, back by sundown," Wade replied, already turning his horse toward the rutted trail that led to Bozeman. The truth was, he needed the distance today. 4 years he'd been on this land, and lately it felt smaller, emptier somehow. He'd built what he'd set out to build, a place that was his alone, where he answered to no man. So why did the silence of his cabin press against his ears like a physical weight each night? Wade shook off the thought. Such thinking was a luxury a rancher couldn't afford, especially with fall coming and preparations needed for the brutal winter ahead. The frontier didn't care about a man's loneliness. It only cared if you were strong enough to survive another season. Bozeman was alive with activity when he arrived. The town had grown substantially since he'd first passed through after the war. The railroad was coming, everyone knew it, and with it would come more settlers, more civilization pressing against the wild edges of the territory. Wade wasn't sure how he felt about that. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, nodding curtly to Peterson, the proprietor. The list in his pocket was short: coffee, ammunition, salt, a few tools. He didn't need much. He was examining a new Bowie knife when the store's bell jangled, announcing another customer. "Miss Ross, what a pleasant surprise. I'd heard you arrived but haven't had the pleasure." Peterson's voice changed entirely, warming with genuine delight. Wade didn't turn immediately, focused on the knife's balance in his palm, but something in Peterson's tone. A respect not commonly afforded to the hardscrabble women who typically inhabited these parts caught his attention. When he did look up, the knife nearly slipped from his grip. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, dressed in a simple blue calico dress that somehow managed to appear elegant despite the frontier setting. Her honey-blonde hair was swept up beneath a modest hat, with a few rebellious tendrils framing a face that would have stopped traffic in New York or Boston. Her complexion was fair but not pale, suggesting she wasn't entirely unfamiliar with the outdoors, though her hands, removing gloves finger by careful finger, showed no calluses or work-worn roughness. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," she replied, her voice carrying the refined tones of Eastern education, but without the affected superiority that often accompanied it. "I'm still getting settled, but Father insisted I come introduce myself to the local merchants." "Dr. Ross is a fortunate man to have such a daughter to help establish his practice," Peterson said, beaming. "Folks around here are mighty pleased to have a proper doctor at last." "He's hoping to open the office by next week," she said, then noticed Wade standing there. Their eyes met and Wade realized he'd been staring. He nodded curtly and turned back to the knife, setting it down with more force than necessary. "Ah, Miss Ross, may I introduce Mr. Wade Vance? Runs a small spread north of town." "Wade, this is Miss Grace Ross, daughter of our new doctor." Wade had no choice but to turn and acknowledge her properly. "Miss Ross," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Vance," she replied with a small nod, her blue eyes, the color of Montana's summer sky, assessing him with unexpected directness. Something about her gaze made him uncomfortably aware of his trail dust, the 3-day stubble on his jaw, the worn quality of his clothes. Not that he cared what some Eastern doctor's daughter thought of him. Women like her came west with romantic notions that quickly withered under the harsh realities of territorial life. They either fled back east or transformed into something harder, less bright. He'd seen it happen too many times to count. Mr. Vance was at Shiloh with the Union forces, Peterson offered, apparently feeling the need to elevate Wade's standing. Built his place from nothing after the war, one of our more successful young ranchers. Is that so? Grace said, that direct gaze still fixed on him. My father served as a surgeon with the Union Army. Perhaps you crossed paths. Doubt it, Wade replied shortly. I didn't spend much time with doctors. The ones who got to us usually had more important things to do than exchange names. A shadow passed across her face, not offense at his brusqueness, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps. Yes, I imagine that's true, she said quietly. Father doesn't speak much of those days either. There was an awkward silence until Peterson cleared his throat. Well, Miss Ross, what can I help you with today? Wade turned away, gathering his supplies and paying quickly. He wanted to be gone, back to the open spaces where he didn't have to make conversation or feel the weight of blue eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted shown. He touched his hat again, muttered a farewell, and headed for the door. Mr. Vance, her voice stopped him at the threshold. He turned reluctantly. Father is holding a small gathering Sunday after services, as newcomers were trying to become acquainted with our neighbors. You'd be welcome to attend. Before he could formulate a refusal, Peterson interjected. Wade's not much for socializing, Miss Ross, keeps to himself mostly. Something flickered in her expression, challenge perhaps. Nevertheless, the invitation stands. Good day, Mr. Vance. Wade nodded stiffly and escaped into the street, irritated at his own discomfort. It was just a woman, for God's sake. He'd dealt with plenty in his 25 years. But as he mounted his horse, he found himself glancing back at the store window where her silhouette was visible against the glass. The last thing he needed was some doctor's daughter complicating his carefully constructed solitude. The frontier was harsh enough without adding a woman's expectations, an inevitable disappointment to the equation. He'd seen what happened to women out here. The work aged them beyond their years, the isolation drove them to madness, or worse, the dangers claimed them entirely. His own mother hadn't lasted 2 winters before a fever took her, leaving his father with a son he barely knew how to raise. No, Wade had built his life precisely to avoid such entanglements. He had his land, his cattle, his handful of loyal hands. It was enough. It had to be enough. He rode home with the sun beating down on his shoulders, trying to forget blue eyes that carried both strength and gentleness in equal measure. By the time his cabin came into view, he'd convinced himself he'd succeeded. But that night, for the first time in years, the silence felt like an accusation rather than a comfort. 3 days later, Wade found himself doing something he hadn't done in nearly a year, shaving meticulously, putting on his single good shirt, and riding toward town on a Sunday morning. He told himself it was simply a matter of restocking supplies he'd forgotten during his last visit. The fact that it coincided with Dr. Ross's gathering was merely convenience. He hadn't planned to attend the church service, but as he approached Bozeman, the bell was ringing, and something compelled him to tie his horse alongside the others and slip into the back pew just as Reverend Michaels was beginning his sermon. The small wooden church was nearly full, a testament to the town's growth, and Wade immediately spotted Grace Ross sitting near the front with an older man who had to be her father. From the back, he could see only her straight posture and the elegant curve of her neck beneath a modest hat. The Reverend's words about community and fellowship washed over him largely unheard. When the service ended, Wade slipped out before the congregation began to mingle, positioning himself across the street, pretending interest in a notice board while watching the church empty. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing or why. This wasn't like him at all. Grace emerged alongside her father, a tall man with silver hair and the same direct gaze as his daughter. They were immediately surrounded by townspeople, all eager to welcome the new doctor. Wade watched as she smiled and spoke with each person, noting how her attention never wavered, how she seemed genuinely interested in what old Mrs. Hawkins or young Tom Fletcher had to say. There was no artifice in her manner, unusual for someone raised with Eastern refinements. He was about to turn away, convinced of the foolishness of his impulse, when she glanced up and caught his eye across the street. Her expression registered surprise, then a smile spread across her face. Not the polite social smile she'd been offering the townsfolk, but something warmer, almost pleased. Before he could react, she said something to her father and began making her way through the crowd toward him. Wade's instinct was to flee, but his feet remained rooted to the spot as she crossed the dusty street, her blue dress swaying with her movement. "Mr. Vance," she said as she reached him, slightly breathless, "you came after all." He touched his hat brim, "Just passing through, Miss Ross." Her smile didn't falter, but something knowing entered her eyes. "Of course. But since you're here, you'll join us for the gathering. It's nothing formal, just some refreshments at our new home. Father has been looking forward to meeting more of the local ranchers." Wade found himself searching for an excuse and coming up empty. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's hardly an imposition when you've been invited," she countered. "Besides, Mrs. Peterson tells me you're something of an authority on local conditions. Father and I would benefit from your experience." It was neatly done, framing his attendance as a favor to them rather than an act of sociability on his part. Wade found himself reluctantly impressed by the tactical maneuver. "I suppose I could stop by briefly," he conceded. "Excellent, we're in the Miller's old place, the white house at the end of Pine Street." In about an hour, without waiting for confirmation, she gave him another smile and turned to rejoin her father. Wade watched her go, wondering what had just happened and why he'd allowed it. He spent the next hour wandering Bozeman aimlessly, debating whether to simply ride home and forget the whole thing. But at the appointed time, he found himself walking up the neat path to the white clapboard house, where a number of horses and carriages were already gathered. The Ross home was modest by Eastern standards, but one of the nicer residences in Bozeman. Inside, it was furnished simply but with obvious quality, evidence of refinement without ostentation. About 20 people milled about, balancing plates of food and cups of punch. Wade immediately felt out of place despite his clean shirt and freshly shaved face. "Mr. Vance," Grace appeared at his elbow, looking genuinely pleased to see him. "You came, let me introduce you to my father." Before he could protest, she had her hand lightly on his arm, guiding him through the gathering toward the silver-haired doctor who was engaged in conversation with Bozeman's mayor. "Father," she said, touching the doctor's shoulder, "this is Mr. Wade Vance, the rancher I mentioned." Dr. Ross turned, and Wade was struck by the intelligence and weariness in the older man's eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much suffering to maintain any illusions about life. "Mr. Vance," the doctor extended his hand. "A pleasure. I understand you're one of the area's successful young cattlemen." Wade shook the offered hand, noting the strength in the doctor's grip despite his age. "I manage a small operation, sir." "Nothing remarkable." "Nonsense," Grace interjected. "Mr. Peterson says you've doubled your herd in 3 years, and your methods for winter survival are among the most effective in the valley." Wade glanced at her, surprised. "You've been asking about me, Miss Ross." A faint blush colored her cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. "I make it a point to learn about my new community, Mr. Vance. Knowledge is never wasted." "My daughter is thorough in her research," Dr. Ross said with obvious affection. "She could have been a fine physician herself, had our backward medical schools been willing to admit women." "Father," Grace protested gently, "Mr. Vance didn't come to hear about educational prejudices." The doctor smiled. "Quite right. Tell me, Mr. Vance, what brought you to Montana after the war? I find people's journeys fascinating." Wade shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to speaking about himself, especially not his motivations. Land was available, seemed as good a place as any to start fresh. "And your family?" Dr. Ross pressed. "None to speak of, sir. Lost my father at Shiloh. Mother passed before that." Something in the doctor's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear it. The war took too many good men. I tried to save as many as I could, but—" "You were at Shiloh?" Wade asked, suddenly more interested. "I was, field hospital near the peach orchard." "Worst 2 days of my life." The doctor's eyes took on that distant look Wade had seen in too many veterans. "We ran out of chloroform by noon the first day. After that," he shook his head. Wade felt a chill despite the warm room. I was with the 15th Michigan, arrived the second day. The doctor's focus sharpened. Then you saw the worst of it, the counterattack. Wade nodded, memories flooding back that he usually kept firmly locked away. Walked across ground so covered with bodies you couldn't see the earth beneath. They fell silent, connected by shared horror that no one else in the cheerful gathering could possibly understand. Wade was surprised to feel Grace's hand touch his arm gently. "Perhaps some punch, Mr. Vance," she suggested, her voice soft with understanding beyond her years. He looked down at her and saw no pity in her eyes, only a deep compassion that somehow didn't feel patronizing. For the first time, he wondered about her story, what had shaped a young woman to recognize pain so clearly without flinching from it. "Thank you," he said, allowing her to lead him toward the refreshment table. As she handed him a cup of punch, she said quietly, "Father rarely speaks of the war, even with me. You must have made quite an impression." Wade took a sip of the overly sweet liquid. War tends to strip away pretenses. "Your father seems like a good man." "The best," she agreed, though his dedication to medicine often came at the expense of family life. After Mother died 5 years ago, it's been just the two of us. She glanced back at her father, now engaged with Reverend Michaels. He wanted a new beginning too. His health isn't what it was, the war took that as well, and he thought the mountain air might help his lungs. Wade studied her profile, noting the strength in her delicate features. "It's not an easy place for new beginnings, Miss Ross, especially for those accustomed to Eastern comforts." She turned back to him, a challenge sparking in her eyes. "You think me too soft for Montana, Mr. Vance? I think the territory breaks most who come here with romantic notions." "And what makes you think my notions are romantic?" There was a sharpness to her tone now. "I've assisted my father in surgery since I was 16. I've seen men die under his hands despite his best efforts. I've held women while they were told their husbands or sons wouldn't be coming home." She set her cup down with deliberate control. "Life isn't romantic anywhere, Mr. Vance. It's merely differently difficult." Wade found himself momentarily at a loss for words, taken aback by the steel beneath her composed exterior. Before he could respond, Mayor Jameson approached, eager to introduce Grace to his wife, and the moment was lost. For the next hour, Wade circulated awkwardly, exchanging brief words with townspeople he rarely socialized with, watching as Grace moved effortlessly through the gathering, at ease with everyone from the banker's wife to the blacksmith's daughter. She possessed a rare gift for making each person feel genuinely heard, adapting her manner to suit each conversation without seeming false. When most guests had departed, Wade found himself lingering, helping Dr. Ross move a heavy bookcase the older man had been struggling with. As they set it against the wall, the doctor wiped his brow and regarded Wade thoughtfully. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Vance." Wade raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Most successful young men in frontier towns are eager to display their prosperity, to establish themselves as leading citizens. You seem determined to remain apart from the community you've joined." Wade bristled slightly. "I pull my weight, send my hands to the barn raisings, contribute to the school fund." "That's not what I meant," Dr. Ross said mildly. "Contribution isn't the same as connection." He glanced toward the kitchen where Grace could be heard washing dishes. "The war taught me that life is too short and too precious to waste in isolation, however self-sufficient it might seem." Wade didn't know how to respond to such directness. He was saved by Grace's return, carrying a tray with coffee. "I thought you gentlemen might appreciate this before Mr. Vance departs," she said, setting it down on a small table. "Actually, I should be heading back," Wade said, suddenly needing to escape the unfamiliar intimacy of the setting. "Cattle don't feed themselves." "Of course," Dr. Ross said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming and for your help with the bookcase. I hope we'll see more of you. You're welcome to visit our ranch if you'd like to see more of the valley," Wade found himself saying, surprising himself with the invitation. "Might be useful for a doctor to know the outlying areas." "I'd welcome that," the doctor replied. "Perhaps next week if you're amenable." Wade nodded, then turned to Grace. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Ross." "I'll walk you out," she said, moving toward the door before he could object. On the porch, the late afternoon sun bathed the street in golden light. Wade settled his hat on his head, aware of her standing close beside him. "You surprised me today, Mr. Vance," she said after a moment. "How's that?" By talking with Father about Shiloh. By seeing me as more than just a useless Eastern transplant." There was a hint of teasing in her voice at the last part. Wade found himself almost smiling. "You surprised me too, Miss Ross." "Grace," she said. "Please call me Grace." He looked down at her, studying the way the sunlight brought out gold highlights in her hair. "Then I'm Wade." She smiled, and something shifted in the air between them. "Until next week, Wade." As he rode home in the gathering dusk, Wade couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. That the carefully constructed isolation he'd built around himself had developed its first significant crack. The thought should have alarmed him. Instead, he found himself replaying conversations, remembering the intelligence in Grace's eyes, the compassion in her touch, the unexpected strength beneath her refined exterior. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to something beyond the predictable rhythm of ranch life. The realization was as unsettling as it was unfamiliar. The following Saturday dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the doctor's visit to the ranch. Wade had spent the week in an unusual state of anticipation, even going so far as to have Samuel and the other hands make some cosmetic improvements to the main house that he'd been putting off for months. He told himself it was simply appropriate respect for a physician, but Samuel's knowing look suggested his oldest hand wasn't fooled. "Been a while since we had a woman out here," Samuel commented as they repaired the front porch steps the day before. "Dr. Ross is coming to familiarize himself with the area," Wade replied tersely. "His daughter merely accompanies him." Samuel just chuckled and hammered a nail with unnecessary force. Now, as Wade stood watching the approach of a small buggy along the rutted ranch road, he found himself unaccountably nervous. He'd faced rebel charges and Sioux war parties with less trepidation than he felt at the prospect of hosting Grace Ross for an afternoon. The buggy pulled up in front of the house, and Dr. Ross climbed down, then turned to help Grace descend. She wore a simple riding skirt and jacket in a deep green that complemented her honey-blonde hair, which today was braided and pinned in a practical style that somehow enhanced rather than diminished her beauty. Her cheeks were flushed from the drive, her eyes bright as she took in the ranch spread before her. "Mr. Vance," Dr. Ross called, extending his hand, "a fine piece of land you have here." "Doctor." "Miss Ross," Wade shook the doctor's hand, then tipped his hat to Grace. "Welcome to the Triple V." "It's exactly as I imagined a Montana ranch would be," Grace said, her gaze taking in the main house. A sturdy log structure that Wade had expanded twice as his fortunes improved, the barn, corrals, and bunkhouse, with the mountains rising majestically in the background. "Though larger than Mr. Peterson led me to believe when he called it modest." Wade felt an unexpected flush of pride. "It's grown some since I started. Come inside, please." Samuel's wife left coffee before heading to town. He led them into the main house, suddenly seeing it through their eyes. The solid furnishings built for function rather than beauty, the few personal touches he'd added over the years. A painting of the Montana landscape he'd purchased from a traveling artist, a handcrafted quilt from the church bazaar draped over his reading chair, books lining rough-hewn shelves. "You have quite a library," Grace noted, moving immediately to examine the shelves while her father settled into one of the sturdy chairs. "Reading passes the winter evenings," Wade replied, pouring coffee for them. "Not much else to do when snow's piled to the windows." "Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman," she ran her fingers along the spines. "Not just practical manuals, you're a philosopher rancher, it seems." Wade handed her a cup of coffee. "Just a man who likes ideas. Hard to come by fresh conversation out here." "I can imagine," she said, accepting the cup, her fingers brushing his momentarily. "Though I suppose that's the trade, solitude for independence." "Something like that," he agreed, surprised by her understanding. They sat and conversed easily about the ranch operations, the doctor asking knowledgeable questions about livestock diseases he might encounter in his practice, Grace contributing observations that revealed she'd been doing her own research on ranching. Wade found himself relaxing into the conversation, even sharing some of the innovations he'd developed for winter feeding that had improved his cattle's survival rates. "I'd like to see the operation, if you're amenable, Doctor," Ross said after they'd finished their coffee. Get a sense of the land. My old bones don't ride as well as they used to, but I can still manage a tour." "Of course," Wade replied. "I have a gentle mare that would suit you, Doctor." As they headed to the barn, Wade noticed Grace eyeing the horses in the corral with obvious interest. "Do you ride, Miss Ross?" he asked. "Since I was a child," she replied, "though it's been some months since I've had the opportunity." "Would you like to join us?" The invitation came easily, without the reluctance he usually felt at the prospect of company. Her face lit up. "I'd love to if it's not an imposition." "No imposition," he assured her, leading them into the barn where 3 horses were already saddled. Samuel must have anticipated the request. The knowing glint in Samuel's eye when he appeared to help them mount confirmed Wade's suspicion. The old hand tipped his hat to Grace with exaggerated courtesy. "Ma'am, Doctor, Boss has been looking forward to your visit all week." Wade shot him a warning look that Samuel cheerfully ignored as he helped Doctor Ross mount the placid bay mare. To Wade's surprise, Grace approached his own spirited gelding, Thunder, a horse few besides Wade could handle with confidence. "May I?" she asked, stroking the animal's neck without hesitation. The horse, normally skittish with strangers, lowered his head to her touch. "He's not usually so friendly," Wade said, impressed. "I have a gentler mount prepared for you." "But he's magnificent," she replied, looking up at the powerful chestnut with admiration. "What's his name?" "Thunder, and he lives up to it." She laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the dim barn. "All the best ones do." She moved to the smaller mare that had been saddled for her. "But I'll save making his acquaintance for another time." Another time, the words lingered as Wade mounted his own horse and led them out into the sunlight. The implication that there would be future visits should have alarmed him, but instead, he found himself hoping it was true. They rode across the ranch land, Wade pointing out features of the property, explaining his grazing rotation system, showing them the creek that provided reliable water even in drought years. Dr. Ross was an attentive listener, but it was Grace who asked the most insightful questions, demonstrating a quick mind and genuine interest in the operation. When they reached a ridge overlooking the valley, they stopped to rest the horses. The view was spectacular, rolling grassland giving way to foothills and then the mountains, with Wade's herd of cattle visible as dark specks in the lush pasture below. "It's breathtaking," Grace said softly, gazing out over the landscape. "I can understand why you chose this place." "It spoke to me the first time I saw it," Wade admitted, surprising himself with the candor. "Felt like somewhere I could belong." "Have you found belonging?" she asked, her blue eyes searching his face. Wade considered the question seriously. "In the land, yes, it asks nothing but honest work and respect, with people," he shrugged. "That's more complicated." "Yet you have loyal hands," she observed. "Samuel clearly respects you greatly." "They're good men, we understand each other." "But you keep them at a distance too," she said, not as criticism but as simple observation. Before Wade could respond, Dr. Ross, who had been scanning the horizon, pointed toward a distant column of smoke rising from beyond a line of trees. "Is that normal?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Wade immediately tensed, hand moving instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "No, that's near Anders' place." He turned to them, all casual conversation forgotten. "We need to head back." "That could mean trouble." They rode back to the ranch at a brisk pace, Wade's mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Anders was an irascible old-timer whose small homestead bordered Wade's land to the east. He lived alone, stubbornly independent despite his 70-plus years. When they reached the ranch yard, Samuel was already organizing the hands, having spotted the smoke as well. "Saddle fresh horses," Wade ordered, dismounting quickly. "Bring rifles and the medical kit." "Already on it, boss," Samuel replied. Johnson rode out for a closer look, could be just a controlled burn, but Anders wouldn't burn this time of year, and he'd have told us, Wade said grimly. He turned to Dr. Ross and Grace. "I apologize for cutting your visit short, but—" "Nonsense," Dr. Ross interrupted, sliding carefully from his horse. "If there's trouble, you may need medical assistance." "I'll come with you." "Father," Grace began, concern evident in her voice. "I'll be careful, daughter," the doctor assured her, "but I can't in good conscience ride back to town if someone might be injured." Wade hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect them from potential danger and the practical value of having a doctor present if Anders was hurt. Grace made the decision for him, dismounting with fluid grace. "I'm coming too. I've assisted Father enough times to be useful." "It could be dangerous," Wade warned. "Might be a simple accident, but fire can also be a distraction for thieves or worse." "All the more reason to have additional help," she replied firmly. "I can ride as well as any of your men, and I'm not squeamish." Wade saw the determination in her eyes and recognized it would be futile to argue. "Stay close to your father and do exactly as I say. If there's any sign of trouble, you both head back immediately." She nodded, her expression serious. "Understood." Within minutes they were riding toward Anders' homestead, a group of 6, Wade, Samuel, 2 ranch hands, and the Rosses. Wade had insisted Grace and her father take the freshest horses, wanting to ensure they could retreat quickly if necessary. As they approached the small clearing where Anders' cabin stood, Wade signaled for them to slow and spread out. The smoke was stronger now, but not as heavy as a fully engulfed structure would produce. The cabin itself came into view, still standing, but with smoke pouring from the chimney and what appeared to be a small brush fire nearby that had been partially controlled. "Anders," Wade called out, approaching cautiously, rifle ready. "It's Wade, Vance." A weak voice answered from inside the cabin. In here, Vance could use a hand. Wade dismounted quickly, gesturing for Dr. Ross to follow while Samuel and the hands secured the area. "Watch the horses," he instructed Grace. "Stay alert." Inside the dimly lit cabin, they found Anders sprawled on the floor near his wood stove, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, his weathered face gray with pain. A pot of beans had boiled over, causing the excess smoke, and it appeared he'd knocked over a lamp in his fall, which had started the brush fire outside when he'd thrown it through the window in panic. "Damn leg gave out," the old man growled through clenched teeth. "Been down since yesterday." Dr. Ross was already kneeling beside him, hands moving with professional efficiency over the injured limb. "Compound fracture," he murmured. "Mr. Anders, I'm Dr. Ross from Bozeman. We're going to help you, but I won't lie, this will be painful." Anders squinted up at him. "Doctor, eh? Well, ain't that providential? Do what you gotta do, Doc." "Ain't my first broken bone." Wade stepped outside to update the others and extinguish the remaining embers of the brush fire. Grace immediately dismounted and moved toward the cabin. "How bad?" she asked, her face composed but concerned. "Broken leg badly. Your father's examining him now." She nodded. "I'll help. We'll need hot water and clean cloth." Before Wade could protest, she was already gathering her skirts and entering the cabin with purposeful strides. He followed, watching as she immediately assessed the situation and began organizing the sparse cabin to serve as an impromptu treatment area, her movements efficient and confident. "Grace will need to set the bone before moving him," Dr. Ross said, not even looking up as she entered. They slipped into what was clearly a well-practiced routine, communication minimal but effective. "Mr. Vance, I'll need you and your strongest man to hold him still," the doctor instructed. "This won't be pleasant." What followed was a grueling hour as Dr. Ross, with Grace's capable assistance, set Anders' broken leg. The old man passed out from the pain despite his stoic determination, which was a blessing for everyone involved. Throughout it all, Grace remained steady, handing her father instruments, cleaning the wound where bone had broken skin, and preparing splints and bandages without hesitation or squeamishness. When it was done, Anders lay unconscious but stabilized on his bed, his leg immobilized in a professional splint. "He can't stay here alone," Dr. Ross said, washing blood from his hands in a basin Grace had prepared. "The break is severe. He'll need regular care for at least 6 weeks, probably longer at his age." "He can come to the ranch," Wade decided. "We'll make up a bed in the house where someone can keep an eye on him." "A generous offer, Doctor." Ross nodded approvingly. "We'll need to fashion a stretcher to move him. The journey will be painful even with the laudanum I've given him." The next few hours were consumed with the careful transportation of Anders back to the Triple V. Wade sent one of his hands ahead to prepare a room, while he, Samuel, and Dr. Ross managed the stretcher. Grace rode alongside, regularly checking the splint and administering small doses of laudanum when Anders' pain broke through his unconsciousness. It was nearly dusk by the time they had Anders settled in a spare room in Wade's house. Grace had taken charge of making the patient comfortable, arranging pillows to elevate his leg, and preparing a broth for when he awoke. Wade stood in the doorway watching her work, struck by her complete competence in a crisis. There was nothing of the delicate Eastern flower about her now, just a capable woman with rolled-up sleeves and determination etched in every movement. "You've done this before," he observed quietly as she checked Anders' pulse. She glanced up, a strand of honey-blonde hair falling across her forehead. "Many times. Father couldn't afford a proper nurse after the war, so I became his assistant." She tucked the blanket more securely around the old man. "People are often surprised that a woman can stomach such work, but suffering doesn't care about propriety." "I'm not surprised," Wade said honestly, "just impressed." A small smile touched her lips. High praise from a man not easily impressed. Dr. Ross joined them, looking weary but satisfied. "He's stable. With proper care and no infection, he should recover, though he'll likely always have some weakness in that leg." "You're welcome to stay the night," Wade offered. "It's too late to start back to town, and you both must be exhausted." "That's very kind," Dr. Ross replied. "I should remain nearby in case his condition changes overnight in any case." Wade nodded. "I'll have Samuel prepare rooms for you both." Later, after a simple but hearty meal prepared by Samuel's wife, who had returned from town to help with the unexpected guests, Wade found himself sitting on the porch with Grace. Dr. Ross had retired early, the day's exertions taking their toll on his health, but Grace seemed reluctant to seek her own rest. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky in magnificent profusion, the kind of display only possible far from city lights. A cool breeze carried the scent of grass and distant pine. "It's beautiful here," Grace said softly, wrapping a borrowed shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "So vast it makes human concerns seem small." "That's part of what I love about it," Wade admitted. "Puts things in perspective." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that exists between people who don't feel the need to fill every moment with words. "Why did you really come west?" Wade finally asked. "Your father could have established a practice in any eastern town with far more comfort and probably more profit." Grace considered the question, her face thoughtful in the lantern light. It wasn't entirely his choice. After the war, he struggled. Not just with his health, but with the memories. She looked out into the darkness. He saved so many, but the ones he couldn't haunted him. The drinking started gradually, just to help him sleep at first, then to get through difficult surgeries, and finally because he couldn't function without it. Wade remained silent, understanding all too well how war could break even the strongest men. 2 years ago, he nearly lost a patient because his hands were shaking too badly to operate, she continued. That was his wake-up call. He stopped drinking entirely, which was difficult. But he also knew he needed a complete change, somewhere without the constant reminders, the social connections that had enabled his decline. She turned to Wade. "The frontier isn't just a place for young men seeking fortune. It's also a place for broken souls seeking redemption." "And you came with him," Wade said, "left everything familiar behind." "He's the only family I have left," she replied simply, "and perhaps I needed a fresh start too. After Mother died, I became the doctor's daughter, the caretaker, the assistant. In Boston, I was defined entirely by my relationships to others. Here," she gestured toward the vast landscape beyond the porch. "Here I can perhaps discover who Grace Ross might be on her own terms." Wade studied her profile, struck by the courage it must have taken to leave everything familiar for such an uncertain future. "And who do you think that might be?" "Grace Ross of Montana Territory." She smiled, the expression containing both humor and determination. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know she's someone who isn't afraid of hard work or challenges. Someone who wants her life to matter beyond social calls and proper marriages." "The frontier has a way of stripping pretenses," Wade said. "Out here, you're judged by what you can do, not who your family is or how you take your tea." "Exactly," she agreed. "Though I admit, sometimes I miss proper tea." They both laughed softly, and Wade realized with a start that it was the first genuine laugh he'd shared with anyone in longer than he could remember. "Today," he said after another comfortable silence, "watching you help your father with Anders, you were remarkable. She glanced at him, surprise evident in her expression. "I only did what was necessary." Many would have fainted at the sight, or at least stayed with the horses as I suggested. He couldn't keep a hint of teasing from his voice at the last part. Grace smiled. "I've never been particularly good at following suggestions when they conflict with what needs doing." Her expression grew more serious. "Though I appreciate your concern, it's been some time since anyone worried about my welfare." Wade felt a strange tightening in his chest at her words. The thought that this capable, compassionate woman had been caring for others with no one to care for her in return seemed fundamentally wrong. "Your father is fortunate to have you," he said finally. "As is Mr. Anders to have you as a neighbor," she countered. "Not everyone would take in a cantankerous old man and provide care for weeks." Wade shrugged. "Out here we look after our own. It's not charity, it's survival." "Is that why you keep people at a distance? Because connection isn't necessary for survival?" Her question was gentle but direct. Wade stared out into the darkness, considering his answer carefully. "After the war, I saw too many men destroyed by what they'd lost, not just limbs or health, but the connections that gave their lives meaning. Wives who couldn't bear what their husbands had become. Children who didn't recognize the stranger who returned." He paused. "It seemed safer not to risk it." "Safer, perhaps, but complete safety is an illusion, isn't it? We all die eventually. The question is whether we truly live before then." Her words hung in the night air, challenging the foundation of the life Wade had built for himself. Before he could formulate a response, the sound of Anders calling out in pain reached them from inside the house. Grace rose immediately. "I should check on him. The laudanum will be wearing off." Wade stood as well, inexplicably reluctant for their conversation to end. "I'll come with you." Together they returned inside to tend to their unexpected patient, the question she'd posed lingering in Wade's mind like a challenge he wasn't sure he was brave enough to answer. The following weeks brought significant changes to the Triple V Ranch. Anders' presence in the spare room meant a constant flow of visitors, Dr. Ross making regular trips from town to check his patient's progress, Grace often accompanying him, and even some of Anders' few friends stopping by with food or news. Wade's carefully maintained isolation gradually dissolved under the steady invasion. He found himself hosting impromptu dinners, engaging in conversations that stretched late into the evening, and worst of all, or perhaps best, though he wasn't ready to admit it, looking forward to Grace's visits with an eagerness that both alarmed and exhilarated him. She had taken to bringing books from her father's extensive library, correctly guessing that Wade's own collection could use expanding. Their discussions about literature and philosophy often continued via notes passed when one or the other had to leave before a conversation was complete. Wade found himself writing lengthy responses in the evenings, analyzing Emerson's views on self-reliance or debating Thoreau's retreat from society in ways he'd never been able to share with anyone before. Today, Grace had arrived alone, explaining that her father had been called to a difficult berth in town, but had sent her with fresh medical supplies for Anders. Wade watched from the corral where he was breaking a young horse as she confidently guided her buggy into the ranch yard. She had taken to wearing more practical attire for her visits, split riding skirts and sturdy boots that allowed her to move easily around the ranch. Today her honey blonde hair was braided simply down her back, catching the October sunlight like spun gold. She waved when she spotted him, her smile visible even at a distance. Wade found himself returning the gesture before he'd even thought about it, earning a knowing chuckle from Samuel, who was working nearby. "Miss Ross sure brightens the place up," the old hand commented, not for the first time. "Never seen the Triple V look so welcoming." Wade ignored the bait, focusing on the spirited colt who was still resisting the saddle. But he couldn't deny the truth in Samuel's words. Somehow, in less than 2 months, Grace had transformed not just his home, but the entire atmosphere of the ranch. Meals were now eaten at the dining table instead of standing over the stove. Fresh curtains hung in windows that had been bare for years. Even the hands seemed to stand straighter, speak more carefully when she was present. More concerning to Wade was the transformation happening within himself. The way he found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't since before the war. The way his thoughts increasingly turned to her when they were apart. The way her opinion had begun to matter more than he'd ever intended to allow anyone's to matter again. By the time he finished with the colt and made his way to the house, Grace was already settled in Anders' room, changing his bandages with practiced efficiency, while the old man complained good-naturedly about being fussed over, like a damn infant. "Language, mister." "Anders," Grace chided without heat. "How will you ever rejoin polite society with such colorful expressions?" Anders snorted. "Polite society can kiss my—" He caught sight of Wade in the doorway and amended, "can take a long walk off a short cliff." Wade leaned against the doorframe, unable to suppress a smile. "Giving Miss Ross trouble again, old man." "She enjoys it," Anders retorted. "Only reason she keeps coming back." Grace laughed, securing the fresh bandage. "That, and to see if you've driven Mr. Vance to distraction yet. Father says you're the most obstinate patient he's ever treated, and he served in field hospitals during the war." "Man's gotta have some standards," Anders said proudly. Grace finished her ministrations and stood, gathering the used bandages. "Your leg is healing well. Another few weeks and you'll be ready to terrorize your own cabin again." Something flickered across Anders' weathered face, concern perhaps. "No rush," he mumbled. "Place is probably full of raccoons by now anyway." Wade caught Grace's eye, sharing a moment of understanding. Despite his complaints, Anders had clearly grown accustomed to the company and care he received at the ranch. Returning to his solitary existence wouldn't be as simple as the old man pretended. "Samuel and the boys are heading over tomorrow to check on your place, make sure everything's secure for winter," Wade said. "No hurry for you to leave until you're fully mended." Relief visibly eased the tension in Anders' shoulders, though he covered it with a gruff nod. "Appreciate it. Be good to know the roof's still on." Grace slipped past Wade into the hallway, and he followed her to the kitchen where she washed her hands in the basin. "Your father couldn't come at all today?" Wade asked, leaning against the wall as he watched her movements. "Mrs. Peterson's having a difficult labor," she replied, concern evident in her voice. "It's her first, and she's older than is ideal. Father may be there all day and night." Wade nodded, understanding the gravity. Childbirth on the frontier remained dangerous despite medical advances. "Will you stay for lunch?" Samuel's wife made stew before heading to town. "I'd like that," Grace agreed, drying her hands. "Actually, I brought something I thought you might enjoy seeing." She retrieved a leather satchel from where she'd left it by the door and extracted a thick packet of papers tied with string. "Father's been organizing his papers, and he found his journal from Shiloh. He thought you might want to read it, said it might answer questions you didn't even know to ask." Wade stared at the packet, a complicated mix of emotions rising within him. "That's unexpected." "You don't have to," she said quickly. "It's quite graphic in parts, but Father said sometimes understanding what happened from another perspective can help make sense of one's own experiences." Wade accepted the journal carefully, as if it might contain explosives. "Thank him for me, I'll consider it." Grace studied his face for a moment, then changed the subject with characteristic sensitivity to his discomfort. "I also brought those seed catalogs I mentioned. If you're serious about starting a kitchen garden next spring, now's the time to plan." The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly, discussing practical matters of ranch improvements and sharing a simple but hearty lunch. Anders joined them at the table for the first time since his accident, hobbling in on a crutch Samuel had fashioned for him, his pride in this achievement evident in his triumphant expression. When it came time for Grace to return to town, Wade found himself reluctant to see her go. The sun was already lowering toward the mountains, painting the landscape in golden hues. "Let me ride with you part way," he offered as he helped her into the buggy. "The trail can be deceptive as the light changes." She looked as if she might protest his concern, but then smiled. "I'd welcome the company." They set off, Wade on Thunder riding alongside her buggy. The air held the crispness of approaching winter, though the day remained pleasant. They spoke little at first, comfortable in the shared silence that had become one of Wade's favorite things about their time together. "Do you miss it?" Grace asked suddenly as they crested a small rise that offered a view all the way to the distant mountains. "The East, I mean, civilization." Wade considered the question. "Sometimes. Hot baths that don't require hauling water, restaurants, bookstores," he glanced at her. "But it never felt like mine the way this does." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I miss certain comforts, museums, concerts." But there's an authenticity here that Boston lacked. People are who they are without so many layers of pretense. Not always a good thing, Wade observed wryly, thinking of some of the rougher characters he'd encountered in Bozeman. Grace laughed. Perhaps not, but at least you know where you stand. She hesitated, then added more softly, I know where I stand with you, for instance. You've never once pretended interest or approval you didn't feel. Wade looked at her sharply, trying to determine if he'd somehow offended her. Is that a complaint? Quite the opposite. Her blue eyes met his directly. It's refreshing. In Boston, young men said whatever they thought would please, regardless of truth. You say little, but what you say, you mean. The directness of her gaze made Wade uncharacteristically flustered. I'm not skilled at the social niceties. Good, she said firmly. Neither am I, despite years of lessons in proper deportment. My instructors despaired of my bluntness. I like your bluntness, Wade admitted, surprising himself. A slight blush colored her cheeks, and I like your honesty. They had reached the point where the ranch trail met the main road to Bozeman. Normally, this was where Wade would turn back, ensuring she was safely on the well-traveled route before returning home. Today, however, he found himself reluctant to part ways. I could ride all the way to town with you, he offered, aware of the lengthening shadows. Make sure you arrive safely. Grace seemed to consider this, then shook her head reluctantly. Father would worry if you didn't return tonight. He'd think something had happened to Anders, she smiled. Besides, this road is well-traveled, I'll be fine. Wade knew she was right, but still he hesitated. The harvest dance is next Saturday in town, he said abruptly. Would you? That is, might you consider attending with me? The invitation had been forming in his mind for days, but he hadn't intended to issue it so awkwardly or at such an inconvenient moment. Yet once the words were spoken, he couldn't regret them, especially when he saw the surprise and pleasure that transformed her expression. I'd be delighted, she replied, her smile brightening the gathering dusk. Truly. Relief and a strange exhilaration flooded through him. Good, that's good. They looked at each other for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, something unspoken passing between them. Until Saturday, then, Grace finally said, gathering her reins more securely. Until Saturday, Wade agreed, touching his hat brim. He watched until her buggy had disappeared around a bend in the road before turning thunder homeward, an unfamiliar feeling of anticipation lightening his chest. The coming week seemed both endless and rushed as Wade prepared for the harvest dance. He hadn't attended a social function in Bozeman since the previous year's 4th of July celebration, and even then he'd remained on the periphery, observing rather than participating. The prospect of escorting Grace, of dancing with her, filled him with equal parts anticipation and dread. Samuel's wife, Martha, took it upon herself to ensure he was properly outfitted, pressing his best shirt and helping him locate the tie he'd purchased years ago and never worn. The motherly attention would have irritated him once. Now he accepted it with awkward gratitude, aware that his appearance mattered in a way it never had before. On the afternoon before the dance, Wade found himself alone in the house, Anders having been moved to the porch to enjoy the unusually mild weather. He retrieved Dr. Ross's journal from where he'd kept it in his bedside drawer, untouched since Grace had given it to him. Something compelled him to open it now, to face whatever truths it might contain. The doctor's handwriting was cramped but legible, the entries terse and clinical at first, then increasingly desperate as the battle progressed. Wade read with growing tightness in his chest as Ross described the overwhelming flood of wounded, the horrific injuries, the impossible choices of triage where men were categorized as likely to live, likely to die, or beyond help. One entry in particular caught his attention, April 7, 1862, midnight. Lost track of how many amputations performed today, at least 15. Young Michigan private brought in with bullet through lung. Insisted on writing letter to mother before allowing treatment. Dictated to nurse while I extracted ball, remarkably steady. Told him odds poor, he replied. Already died yesterday crossing that field. Everything now is borrowed time. Survived surgery, doubt he'll see morning. Wade stared at the passage, memory slamming into him with physical force. He had been that Michigan private, though he'd never known the name of the exhausted surgeon who'd extracted the rebel bullet from his lung. He remembered dictating the letter, remembered the certainty that he was dying, remembered the strange calm that had come with acceptance. Yet here he was, 13 years later, alive when so many others had perished. Borrowed time indeed. He continued reading, finding no further mention of himself specifically, but gaining a new perspective on the battle he'd experienced from the front lines. Dr. Ross had seen it from behind in the constant flow of broken bodies and desperate men. Two sides of the same horrific coin. When he finally closed the journal, night had fallen. Wade sat in the darkened room, thoughts churning. He'd built his life on the premise that isolation was safety, that connections were vulnerabilities he couldn't afford. Yet everything about the past weeks, Anders in his spare room, the doctor's friendship, Grace's growing presence in his life, challenged that foundation. Already died yesterday crossing that field, everything now is borrowed time. His own words, spoken in what he'd believed were his final hours, now returned to haunt him. If everything since Shiloh was borrowed time, what had he done with that precious gift? Built walls, kept people at arm's length, survived, but had he truly lived? Grace's question from weeks before echoed in his mind. Complete safety is an illusion, isn't it? We all die eventually. The question is whether we truly live before then. Wade stood and moved to the window, looking out at the stars scattered across the Montana sky. Tomorrow he would escort Grace to the dance. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would begin to answer that question differently. Saturday dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day. Wade completed his chores with unusual efficiency, then spent an inordinate amount of time preparing himself for the evening ahead. By late afternoon, he was as ready as he'd ever be, dressed in his best clothes, thunder groomed to a gleaming shine, nervous in a way that battles and business deals had never made him. "You look mighty fine, boss," Samuel commented as Wade prepared to depart. "Miss Ross is a lucky lady." Wade felt his face warm. "I'm the fortunate one," he admitted gruffly. The old hand clapped him on the shoulder. "About time you figured that out." The ride to town seemed both too long and too short. Wade rehearsed conversations in his head, then abandoned them as foolish. Grace had never required practiced pleasantries from him. She wouldn't expect them now. He arrived at the Ross residence precisely at the appointed time. Dr. Ross answered his knock, looking pleased but also slightly protective as he invited Wade inside. "Grace will be down shortly," the doctor said, offering Wade a seat in their small parlor. "I trust you'll have her home at a reasonable hour." "Of course, sir," Wade replied, feeling oddly like a much younger man under the doctor's assessing gaze. Dr. Ross studied him for a moment longer, then his expression softened. "She thinks very highly of you, you know. I haven't seen her this animated since before her mother passed." Wade wasn't sure how to respond to such directness. "Your daughter is extraordinary," he said finally. "I've never met anyone quite like her." "Nor will you," the doctor agreed with paternal pride. "She has her mother's beauty but a spirit entirely her own." He leaned forward slightly. "Did you read the journal?" Wade nodded. "I did, thank you for sharing it." He hesitated, then added, "I was that Michigan private, the one with the lung wound who dictated a letter to his mother." Dr. Ross's eyes widened. "Good Lord." "I had no idea," he shook his head in wonder. "When I wrote that entry, I was certain you wouldn't survive the night." "Makes two of us," Wade said with a hint of dark humor. "It seems I've been living on borrowed time ever since." The doctor's expression grew thoughtful. "Perhaps, or perhaps you were spared for a purpose." His gaze was penetrating. "Have you discovered what that might be?" Before Wade could formulate a response, a soft step on the stairs drew both men's attention. Grace appeared in the doorway, and Wade forgot whatever he might have said as he rose to his feet. She wore a dress the color of summer cornflowers, simple by Eastern standards perhaps, but elegantly cut to complement her slender figure. Her honey-blonde hair was partially up, with soft curls framing her face and longer locks cascading down her back. She wore no jewelry except small pearl earrings that had been her mother's, but she needed no adornment. "You look beautiful," Wade said, the words emerging with complete honesty rather than social obligation. A delicate blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you, you're quite handsome yourself." Dr. Ross cleared his throat. "Well, I suppose I should let you young people be on your way. The dance will be starting soon." He gave his daughter a quick kiss on the cheek. "Enjoy yourself, my dear. You've earned some pleasure after all your hard work." The town hall was already filled with people when they arrived. The space transformed by harvest decorations and lantern light into something almost magical. A small band played in one corner, and couples were already dancing while others mingled around tables laden with food brought by the townspeople. Wade was acutely aware of Grace's hand on his arm as they entered, of the many glances that came their way, curious, approving, and in a few cases, openly envious. He'd never particularly cared what others thought of him before, but tonight, with Grace beside him, he found himself oddly grateful for the respect he'd earned in the community. "Mr. Vance, Miss Ross," Mrs. Peterson approached, beaming. "How wonderful to see you both, and together. I must say, you make a very handsome couple." Wade felt Grace's hand tighten slightly on his arm, but she smiled graciously. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. How is the baby?" "Father said he's thriving." The older woman launched into a detailed account of her new grandson's accomplishments, which were apparently remarkable despite his being less than 2 weeks old. Wade listened with half an ear, more focused on the warmth of Grace's presence beside him and the way the lantern light caught gold highlights in her hair. When Mrs. Peterson finally moved on to share her news with others, Grace turned to Wade with amusement in her eyes. "I believe we've just received unofficial approval from Bozeman's most dedicated matchmaker." Wade felt his face warm. "Does that concern you?" "Not at all," she replied, her direct gaze meeting his. "Does it concern you?" He considered the question honestly. A month ago, perhaps even a week ago, it might have. Now he found it bothered him not at all. "No," he said simply. Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Good, now I believe you promised me a dance." Wade had never been much of a dancer, but he'd made sure to practice the basic steps with Martha's patient instruction during the week. As he led Grace onto the floor for a waltz, he sent a silent prayer of thanks to the ranch cook for her persistence. Grace fit perfectly in his arms, following his lead with natural grace despite his occasional misstep. The music, the movement, the touch of her hand in his, it all combined to create a moment of such unexpected joy that Wade felt almost dizzy with it. "You dance very well for a man who claims to avoid social gatherings," Grace observed as they circled the floor. "I had help," he admitted. "Martha wouldn't let me embarrass you." Her expression softened. "You could never embarrass me, Wade." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet certainty, threatened to undo him entirely. In that moment, with her in his arms and the music surrounding them, Wade finally acknowledged to himself what he'd been fighting for weeks. He was falling in love with Grace Ross. Perhaps had already fallen, irrevocably and completely. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a clarity he hadn't felt since the day he'd first seen his land and known it was where he belonged. They danced several more dances, then took a break to sample the generous spread of food. Wade found himself introduced to people he'd seen for years but never properly met, drawn into conversations he might once have avoided. With Grace beside him, it all seemed easier somehow, more natural. As the evening progressed, they stepped outside for a breath of air. The night was clear and cool, stars brilliant above, the sounds of music and laughter spilling from the hall behind them. They walked a short distance to a small garden area where a bench offered a place to rest. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Grace asked as they sat, her shoulder nearly touching his. "More than I expected to," Wade admitted. "Though that has less to do with the dance and more to do with the company." She smiled, pleased. "I'm glad. I've been looking forward to this all week." "As have I," Wade hesitated, then added, "I read your father's journal." Grace turned to face him more directly. "Did it help?" Father hoped it might. "It did in an unexpected way." Wade looked up at the stars, gathering his thoughts. "I was one of his patients at Shiloh, the Michigan private with the lung wound who dictated a letter to his mother." Her eyes widened. "But he thought that soldier wouldn't survive the night." "So did I," Wade said quietly. "I was certain I was dying, had made my peace with it even. And when I didn't die, when I somehow survived that night and the next, and eventually recovered enough to be sent home, I didn't know what to do with that borrowed time." Grace remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I told myself I was building something meaningful here, my ranch, my independence, and it was important, it is important, but I think I was also hiding. Using my work, my solitude, as a shield against really living." He turned to look at her directly, "Until you arrived." Her breath caught audibly, her blue eyes luminous in the starlight. "Wade, you asked me once whether I'd found belonging," he continued, needing to complete the thought before courage failed him. The truth is I thought I had, in the land, in the work. But these past weeks have shown me what I was missing. He took her hand, marveling at the delicate strength of it. When you're at the ranch, it feels more like home than it ever has before. Grace's fingers tightened around his. I feel that too, she whispered. When I'm there, when I'm with you, I feel like I've found where I belong. The admission hung between them, momentous and fragile. Wade raised his free hand to brush a strand of honey-blonde hair from her cheek, the gesture infinitely tender. Grace, he said softly, I'm not good with words, never have been, but I need you to know that you've changed everything for me. The way I see the world, the way I see myself, the way I see the future. She leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. And how do you see the future now? With you in it, he answered simply, honestly, if you'd want that too. Her smile bloomed slowly, transforming her already beautiful face into something radiant. I want that very much, she whispered. The distance between them disappeared as Wade leaned forward and Grace met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, questioning, a moment suspended in time. When they parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by the emotions coursing through him. We should return to the dance, Grace said eventually, though she made no move to rise. People will talk. Let them, Wade replied, but he stood and offered her his hand. Though your father might have my hide if I keep you out here too long. She laughed softly, placing her hand in his. He likes you very much, you know. Says you're a man of integrity. High praise from someone whose opinion I value, Wade said as they walked back toward the hall. For the remainder of the evening, something had shifted between them, a certainty, an acknowledgement of what was growing. They danced closer, spoke more intimately, their hands finding each other naturally whenever they were near. When Wade finally escorted Grace home, neither wanted the evening to end. On her porch, under the watchful glow of the lamp her father had left burning, they shared a second kiss, deeper than the first, full of promise and longing. Will you come for Sunday dinner tomorrow? Grace asked as they reluctantly parted. Father would be delighted, and so would I. Try to keep me away, Wade replied, his voice husky with emotion. As he rode home under the vast Montana sky, Wade felt as though the stars themselves were celebrating with him. The man who had built walls around his heart had found at last that true strength lay not in isolation, but in the courage to love and be loved in return. The coming months brought significant changes to Wade's life. Sunday dinners with the Rosses became a weekly tradition. Grace visited the ranch regularly, often staying for days at a time to help care for Anders, whose recovery progressed steadily but slowly. Her presence transformed the Triple V from a mere workplace into a genuine home, filled with conversation, laughter, and increasing warmth. As winter settled over Montana, bringing snow and bitter cold, Wade found himself making the journey to Bozeman more frequently than ever before, regardless of weather. The hands exchanged knowing glances as he rode out, but their teasing was good-natured. Even Anders, now able to hobble around with a cane, offered gruff advice about courting proper when Wade returned from town. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations for the first real holiday celebration the ranch had seen in years. Martha decorated the main house with pine boughs and red ribbons, while Samuel and the other hands constructed a proper dining table large enough to accommodate the guests Wade had invited. Dr. Ross and Grace, of course, but also Anders' few friends, the Reverend, and several neighboring ranchers who would otherwise spend the holiday alone. The morning before Christmas Eve, Wade rode to town one final time before the gathering. He carried carefully wrapped gifts in his saddlebags, books for Dr. Ross, a handcrafted wooden box for Grace that Samuel had helped him make, containing a delicate silver pendant Wade had commissioned from a silversmith in Helena who specialized in Montana sapphires the exact color of Grace's eyes. But the most important item he carried was tucked securely in his inner pocket, a small velvet box containing his mother's ring, the only heirloom he'd managed to keep through the war and his journey west. He'd retrieved it from the bank in Bozeman the previous week, had it cleaned and sized by the jeweler, and now carried it with equal parts nervousness and determination. He'd planned to wait until the new year to take things slowly, but something had shifted in him recently. Perhaps it was the journal he still reread occasionally, the reminder of borrowed time. Perhaps it was the way Grace looked at him when they were together, as if she'd found something precious she hadn't known she was seeking. Perhaps it was simply that, Having finally opened his heart after keeping it carefully guarded for so long, he found he had no patience for unnecessary delay. The town was busy with last-minute holiday preparations when he arrived, streets filled with people despite the cold. Wade conducted his remaining business efficiently, then headed for the Ross residence, anticipation building with each step. He was surprised to find Dr. Ross alone when he arrived, Grace having been called to help Mrs. Peterson with some crisis involving Christmas pudding. She should return shortly, the doctor assured him, inviting Wade to warm himself by the fire. Unless Mrs. Peterson's kitchen disaster requires extensive intervention. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, then Dr. Ross fixed Wade with a penetrating look. "You seem to have something on your mind, son." Wade straightened in his chair, suddenly nervous in a way battles had never made him. "I do, sir. I'd like to ask for your blessing to marry Grace." The doctor didn't seem surprised, merely thoughtful. "You love her," he said, a statement rather than a question. "More than I knew was possible," Wade replied honestly. "She's changed everything for me." Dr. Ross nodded slowly. "And you for her. I've watched my daughter blossom these past months in ways that bring her mother to mind." He leaned forward slightly. "Grace is the most precious thing in my life, Wade. Her happiness means everything to me." "It means everything to me too," Wade said quietly. "I know I can't offer her the refinements of Eastern life, but I swear I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of her." A slow smile spread across the doctor's face. "I have no doubts on that score." He extended his hand. "You have my blessing and my thanks for making her so happy." Wade clasped the offered hand, relief and gratitude washing through him. "Thank you, sir. When do you plan to ask her?" "Tonight, if the moment seems right," Wade admitted. "I know it's perhaps too soon by some standards, but—" "Life is too short for unnecessary waiting," Dr. Ross interrupted gently. "Especially out here where tomorrow is never guaranteed." They heard the front door open then, bringing with it a gust of cold air and Grace's voice calling out a greeting. Wade stood as she entered the parlor, her cheeks flushed from the cold, snowflakes melting in her honey-blonde hair. She was breathtakingly beautiful in her blue woolen coat, her eyes brightening as they fell on him. "Wade, I didn't expect you until tomorrow." She crossed to him quickly, removing her gloves to take his hands in hers. "I had some final business in town," he explained, suddenly hyper-aware of her father's knowing presence. "And I wanted to see you." Dr. Ross cleared his throat. "I just remembered some patient notes I need to review before tomorrow." "If you'll excuse me," he exited with a barely concealed smile, closing the parlor door behind him. Grace raised an eyebrow. "That was hardly subtle. What were you two discussing?" "You actually," Wade admitted, leading her to sit beside him on the small sofa. "I had something important to ask your father." Her eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned. "Wade." He took her hands in his heart pounding so hard he was certain she must hear it. "Grace, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light and warmth to places I'd resigned myself to keeping cold and dark. You've shown me that real strength isn't found in isolation but in connection." Tears were already gathering in her blue eyes as he continued. "I came west thinking I was building a life, but I was really just surviving. It wasn't until you arrived that I truly began to live again." Wade released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing the small velvet box. "I know it hasn't been very long, and if you think we should wait, I'll respect that. But I also know with absolute certainty that my heart is yours completely." He opened the box, revealing the delicate gold ring with its small diamond that had been his mother's. "Grace Ross, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled onto her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Wade Vance. I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her. When he looked up, the love shining in her eyes mirrored what he felt in his own heart. Their kiss was a promise, a beginning, a declaration. When they finally parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by joy and gratitude. "When?" Grace asked, her voice soft with emotion. "When shall we marry?" "As soon as you'd like," Wade replied. "Tomorrow, if it were possible." She laughed, the sound like music. "Perhaps not quite that soon, but I see no reason to wait until spring. January, perhaps." After New Year. January it is, he agreed, kissing her again simply because he could. Later, when Dr. Ross returned to the parlor to find them sitting close together, Grace's hand now adorned with his mother's ring, the older man embraced them both with genuine joy. They decided that Wade would announce their engagement at the Christmas gathering the following day, with a January wedding to follow at the small church in Bozeman. As Wade prepared to leave, needing to return to the ranch before dark to help with final preparations for tomorrow's celebration, Grace walked with him to the front door. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting in the early twilight. "I still can't quite believe it," she said, looking down at the ring on her finger, "that this is real." "Believe it," Wade said, drawing her into his arms. "I've never been more certain of anything." She nestled against him, fitting perfectly as she always did. "Do you remember the first time we met, in the general store?" "Of course. You were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and I was determined to avoid you at all costs." He smiled at the memory of his former self, so intent on maintaining his isolation. "And now," she asked, lifting her face to his. "Now I can't imagine a day without you," he replied honestly. "You've become essential to me, Grace." She held his gaze, her expression solemn despite her smile. "When I first took your hand, that day at Anders' cabin, I needed your strength but feared what it might mean to rely on someone again. After Mother died, after Father's struggles, I'd convinced myself that independence was safer than connection." Wade understood completely. We were both hiding from the same fear in different ways. "And now we've both found the courage to step beyond it," she whispered. Together. Their final kiss before he departed was a pledge, an acknowledgement of the journey they'd taken from strangers bound by caution to lovers bound by choice. The Christmas celebration at the Triple V was everything Wade had hoped for and more. The house was filled with warmth, conversation, and laughter as guests gathered around the extended table. Anders, now using only a cane and preparing to return to his own cabin after the new year, held court at one end, regaling everyone with increasingly exaggerated tales of his accident and recovery. Dr. Ross sat at Wade's right, conversing easily with Samuel about medicinal plants native to the region. Martha had outdone herself with the meal, producing a feast that would have been impressive even in the finest Eastern homes. But it was Grace, seated at Wade's left, her hand occasionally finding his beneath the table, who made the gathering truly special. When the meal was complete and everyone was relaxed with coffee and Martha's apple pie, Wade stood and called for attention. Silence fell gradually as the guests turned expectant faces toward him. "I want to thank you all for joining us today," he began, uncharacteristically nervous about speaking to the gathered group. "When I came to Montana, I believed I was seeking independence above all else. I built this ranch to stand apart, to rely on no one." He looked around at the faces watching him, Anders gruff but attentive. Samuel and Martha, who'd been more family than employees these past years. The Reverend, who'd welcomed him to services with increasing frequency. Neighbors who'd become friends. And finally Grace, her blue eyes shining with encouragement and love. "What I've learned, especially these past months, is that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from standing together. From building connections rather than walls." He extended his hand to Grace, who rose to stand beside him. "Which is why I'm overjoyed to announce that Miss Grace Ross has done me the extraordinary honor of agreeing to become my wife." A chorus of congratulations erupted, glasses raised in toasts, and several of the women dabbing at suspiciously damp eyes. Anders thumped his cane on the floor in enthusiastic approval, while Dr. Ross beamed with paternal pride. "To Wade and Grace," Samuel called out, raising his glass higher. "May their future be as bright as they deserve." "To Wade and Grace," the others echoed. As Wade looked at the woman beside him, her face alight with happiness, he marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From the blood-soaked fields of Shiloh to this moment of pure joy, from a man determined to need no one to a man humbled and completed by love. The wedding took place on a crisp January morning, the small church in Bozeman filled to capacity with well-wishers. Wade stood at the altar, nervous in a new suit ordered from Helena, Samuel beside him as his best man. When Grace appeared at the back of the church on her father's arm, a collective murmur of appreciation swept through the gathering. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with a lace veil that had been her mother's. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in an intricate style adorned with small white flowers, but it was her face that captivated Wade, radiant with happiness, her blue eyes never leaving his as she moved toward him. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Wade was acutely aware of Grace's hand in his, of the tremor in her voice as she spoke her vows, of the weight of the gold band he placed on her finger to join his mother's ring. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was both a culmination and a beginning. The celebration afterward filled the town hall, spilling into the street despite the winter chill. It seemed all of Bozeman had turned out to celebrate the union of the respected rancher and the beloved doctor's daughter. Wade moved through the crowd in a daze of happiness, Grace's hand firmly in his, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who only months before had been mere acquaintances. Anders, now fully recovered and back in his own cabin, though a frequent visitor to the Triple V, approached them with uncharacteristic formality, leaning heavily on his cane. "Got something for you both," he said gruffly, producing a folded document from his pocket. "Been meaning to do this for a while now, seems like the right time." Wade unfolded the paper, Grace looking over his shoulder. It was a deed transfer, formally adding the small parcel of land that was Anders' homestead to the Triple V ranch. "Anders, we can't accept this," Wade protested, shocked by the generous gift. The old man waved away his objection. "Sure you can, I'm too damn old to work it properly, and I've got no family to leave it to. You two looked after me when I needed it. Besides," he added with a sly grin, "this way I get to stay in my cabin but have you young folks do all the hard work." "I'd call that a fair deal." Grace stepped forward and kissed the weathered cheek. "Thank you," she said softly. "You'll always have a place with us, you know that." Anders blushed fiercely beneath his beard. "Yeah, well, just be sure to name your first son after me and we'll call it square." As he hobbled away, Grace turned to Wade with a mixture of amusement and emotion in her eyes. "Our first son." Wade drew her slightly away from the crowd, into a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "What do you think about that? Children, I mean, we haven't really discussed it." Her expression softened, becoming serious but tender. "I would love to have children with you, Wade, to build a family together on the land you love so much." She hesitated. "But I hope you'll understand that I'd like to continue assisting Father as well, at least until he trains someone else." "The work is important to me." Wade lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above her wedding ring. "I would never ask you to give up something that matters to you. We'll find a way to make it all work, the ranch, your medical work, children when the time is right." The gratitude and love in her eyes was all the confirmation he needed that they would indeed find their way together, balancing their individual passions with their shared life. As the celebration continued into the evening, Wade found moments to marvel at the transformation of his life. 6 months ago, he had been a man who believed connection was weakness, who had built walls around his heart as sturdy as those around his property. Now he stood as a husband, surrounded by a community he'd finally allowed himself to join, his future entwined with a woman who had shown him that true courage lay in vulnerability. Later that night, after they had bid farewell to the last of their guests and retired to the hotel room reserved for them before they would return to the ranch the following day, Wade held his wife in his arms and thanked whatever fate or providence had brought them together. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, "more than I have words to express." Grace lifted her face to his, her blue eyes reflecting the depth of emotion he felt. "Then show me," she whispered back. And he did, with all the tenderness and passion that had grown between them, sealing their vows in the most intimate way possible. Spring came early to Montana that year, bringing with it new beginnings for the Triple V. The ranch house had been expanded over the winter, adding rooms that would eventually become a nursery and a small office where Grace could continue her medical studies. Dr. Ross visited frequently, his health improving with each passing month as he gradually trained a young assistant to eventually take over some of his duties. Wade and Grace settled into marriage with a natural ease that surprised them both. They had their disagreements, of course, her occasionally stubborn independence clashing with his protective instincts, his habit of silent brooding when troubled meeting her insistence on open communication. But each challenge only deepened their understanding of each other, strengthening rather than weakening their bond. On a warm evening in late May, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and pink. Grace's head rested against Wade's shoulder, his arm around her waist, holding her close. "I have news," she said softly, turning slightly to see his face. "News I've been fairly certain of for a few weeks, but Father confirmed it today." Wade looked down at her, puzzled by the mix of nervousness and joy in her expression. "What is it?" She took his hand and guided it to rest against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Wade, around Thanksgiving, Father thinks." For a moment Wade couldn't speak, overcome by a surge of emotion so powerful it left him breathless. Then he gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which to him she was. "A baby," he whispered, wonder in his voice. "Our child." Grace laughed softly, joyful tears in her eyes. "Yes, our child, who will grow up here on this beautiful land, knowing how much they are loved." Wade placed his hand again on her stomach, marveling at the miracle growing within. "I never thought I could be this happy," he admitted. "Never believed I deserved it." "You deserve every happiness," Grace said firmly, covering his hand with her own, "and so much more." As the sun's last rays gilded the mountains, Wade thought again of that long-ago day at Shiloh, when he had believed his life was ending. How strange and wonderful that it had instead been just beginning, a journey that had led him here, to this woman, this love, this future full of promise. She held his hand like she needed him and feared it no longer. And he held hers the same way, with gratitude for every moment of the borrowed time they would spend together, building a life, a family, and a legacy on the land they both called home.